On behalf of the Yarra Drug and Health Forum, I'd like to welcome you all here today. My name is Peter Wearne. I'm the current chair of the YDHF. And before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the fact that we are all meeting on stolen Aboriginal land somewhere in this great country. And we would acknowledge the elders, leadership, emerging leadership, all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are in this meeting, and pay our respects to them and pay our respects to the ancient and wise culture that has been present in this land for thousands and thousands of years. We also would like to acknowledge our regret and shame at the way we have treated Aboriginal people and their culture during the time of colonisation and settlement, and look forward to a day when it is truly a respectful relationship that acknowledges the errors of the past and moves forward into the future with grace and humility and respect for one another. So it's great to have you all here today. I myself am on Wurundjeri land, and I give a shout out to Uncle Colin Hunter, who is a local Wurundjeri elder, and pay my respects to him personally. So today is the annual meeting of the Yarra Drug and Health Forum. Now, we aren't required by any constitutional arrangement, because we're not an incorporated body, to have these meetings. We just love talking and talking to each other, so that's why we do it. And it's always a great opportunity to really hear from people who are respected and significant thinkers and activists and workers within the area of drug and alcohol policy, not just in Yarra, but across the state, across the country. And today is no exception. And on behalf of the executive and membership of the Yarra Drug and Health Forum, I'd like to welcome Sione Crawford. Sione is the CEO of Harm Reduction Victoria. And Sione's been in that role for 7 years, 8 years, Sione? 10 years? How long?
Oh, much less than that.
How long?
3.
Oh, 3, okay.
At HFIC.
Just seems like you've been around that long, Sione, that's all.
Yeah, I've been working in user orgs for 20 years, so pretty close.
And Sione really graciously accepted at the last minute. We had another presenter who was going to present, but unfortunately they got seriously ill, and we didn't pursue that with that person, and Sione stepped in at the last minute. So I just want, for transparency, I'd just like to acknowledge that. And he's certainly not second in line, because the work that Harm Reduction Victoria does around stigma, discrimination and advocacy for people with lived and living experiences of drug use is really, really important to our community. And in that vein, we've invited Sione to talk about the impact of stigma, discrimination, and thinking about a way forward in that area. And Sione speaks on this topic regularly and eloquently, and it's our great privilege to have him here today. So we welcome you today, Sione. Over to you.
Thanks, Pete. That's a lovely introduction. And it feels like I've been around forever, but I have been at HFIC for about 3 years and took over from the wonderful Jenny Calsell there. And but I have been working in this field for a while. And actually, I refer to that a little bit in the at the start of this talk. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that I'm coming to you from today as well. And I'm on Wurundjeri country, and I acknowledge that this land has never been ceded, and thank Aboriginal custodians for looking after it for us for so long. And hopefully we can be part custodians moving forwards as well, and actually take some of the issues like climate change seriously. Anyway, I am glad to step in, and I have spoken about this topic a few times over the past few months and years. And actually, I've got a PowerPoint as well, mainly to keep me on track. Is it possible to share that, Nick or Bernadette, or I can as well? Doesn't matter that much, really, but
should be able to go now.
Beautiful, thank you. There we go. Okay. So, all right. I suppose within this talk, I'd also like to acknowledge any people who lived a living experience of illicit drug use in particular as well, who are here, and acknowledge the resilience of our community as well as I do this talk. So let me just get my ducks in a row. Yep, there we go. So I just thought I'd do a really quick sort of background on stigma. I won't talk about everything on the slide. You can read it yourself. Fine. I just wanted to really kind of position what I'm going to talk about as a social issue, really. So stigma, in the context that we're talking about here, people who use drugs and inject drugs in particular, I think it's really important to remember that it is actually an intentional and social act of exclusion. And we as people who use drugs often end up internalizing that as well, in the context of sort of a spoiled identity or a feeling not quite one of the rest of society, not quite valuable or valid. And that happens in a whole range of ways that I'm sure many of us are aware of, and there are sort of really obvious examples of stigma and discrimination, and then there are the more subtle versions. You know, it's pretty obvious when people use words like junkie and abuse people, or ignore them dying on the street or whatever. But there are also some not so dramatic versions of stigma as well, and those are often quite tricky to pin down. Stigma kind of operates at a whole range of levels. It operates on an individual level in terms of internalization and in terms of how we think about ourselves. It operates at an interpersonal level, and that's often about being stigmatized by or discriminated against by another individual. And those are the ones that are talked about quite a lot, particularly interpersonal. People talk about, doing worker training and so on to, stop individual workers from being discriminatory or make them understand how this works and operates. And that's important. But unfortunately, it's really the other levels of organizational or service level stigma and discrimination and really the structural ones as well, or versions of stigma that really sort of shape how this operates day to day, how this operates across society, I should say, for us, and then manifests in a day-to-day way. And I'm going to try and sort of talk about that a little bit as well, and also hopefully have a little bit of a chat about some of the different things that we've learned over the years that maybe will help with this. An example of the not always dramatic versions is probably we see it all the time at Harm Reduction Victoria, and the classic example really would be that, I know that I was talking to Sarah at PAMS about a particular client of hers, and this has actually happened for me as well, personally as well, where when a health referral might occur from your GP or your methadone doctor even, or your pharmacotherapy doctor to another allied health service or to a specialist at a hospital or whatever, it's a really common kind of experience for everything to be going and traveling along really well until the conversation starts about your other medications. And when things like methadone are brought up, most of us have experienced at different times the whole process just slowing right down, the atmosphere changing completely, and a really different kind of vibe coming over the whole thing. And things like that are really, really hard to pin down, but it's how it's these sort of not so obvious versions of stigma and discrimination that are really hard to change. Just for some numbers, I'm not going to go over all of these numbers, but I just wanted to point out that on this slide, essentially it's a piece of work done by the University of New South Wales, the Centre for Social Research and Health, around stigma indicators, and they're sort of measuring some different stigma indicators over time, and in the context of people who inject drugs. In 2018, 81% of participants in their research reported experiencing stigma and discrimination in the last 12 months in relation to their injecting drug use. And for 28% of them, it was often or always, which means that, basically for that whole, for the way that you answer that question is basically like, in the last 12 months, have you felt stigmatized against for your drug use? And if you answer always, you're part of the 10%. If you answer often, you're part of the 18%. If you answer sometimes, you're part of the 51%. that's sometimes, often, or always. And then when you answer a question about enacted stigma, or how stigma is actually how you felt stigma from, in this case, healthcare workers, around 70% felt that health workers had treated us negatively or differently to other people. And 1 in 4 participants indicated this was often or always the case. And although that's awful, and it's important to be clear that feeling stigma is actually, and discrimination is actually the thing that matters. The feeling of it is what matters, not necessarily the intention of the healthcare worker. If you're feeling stigma and discrimination, if a healthcare worker didn't intend to make you feel that way, it's still something that needs to be dealt with. But even within that context, there's another question, which is actually for other healthcare workers. And so this question asks whether or not in the last 12 months you've witnessed any of your colleagues behaving negatively towards patients or clients because of a range of things, and injecting drug use is highlighted there, and that's the one that obviously we're talking about today in particular. But it's worth noting that by comparison, the stigma discrimination witnessed by healthcare workers is most prevalent around injecting drug use, although by no means the only thing that people have to suffer this through. And so in this context, essentially, it's just healthcare workers seeing other, their colleagues stigmatizing others, and unfortunately over, 15% see it often or always, and around 50 see it sometimes, often or always. And that's in 2018, and we've got no reason to think that will have changed. In fact, although it's important not to, there were different cohorts that answered these surveys. Basically, this had increased since the last time they did this in 2016. So it's getting worse, ultimately, is the feeling, even though, I've got to be careful what you say, it certainly hasn't got better, it would seem. So in the context of organisational stigma, and I suppose, I'm sort of elevating it now a little bit beyond sort of the interpersonal stuff, and thinking about how organisations and services that we're all part of, how we are all complicit in that. And the reason I'm sort of talking about this is because I'm going to make a pretty strong assumption that most, if not all, of the people here at the Yarra Drug and Health Forum probably don't, generally speaking, I wouldn't say any of you intentionally stigmatise or discriminate against people who use drugs. It's why you're here, after all, I think, to advance our shared causes. But unfortunately, the organisations we're part of and the society we're part of continually does do that. And so in that respect, we're all complicit. And I would put myself, as the CEO of a drug user organisation, unfortunately, there are things that we do that don't sit well with me personally, which I'll come to in a second. But, essentially, it's all well and good being able to be nicer to people in our interpersonal relationships. But what's really hard is changing the things that are around us and aren't completely in our control. I suppose a way that I'd ask people to think about this is to sort of think about, in the organisational service that you work in, if you work in AOD in particular, but even more broadly than that, sort of what do you know, if you're a manager, or even if you're not a manager, if you're understanding of the policy that exists in your workplace, do you know what would happen if I was working for you and you found out I was a person who used drugs, or who had turned up to work appearing to be under the influence of drugs, or someone had told you that I'd used at work or before work. And I would venture that most of us work in organisations that, even if we have respectful policies, they very likely probably demand that an individual, the person, changes in some way. That the reason for that usually is because the drug use itself is likely illegal. And so Harm Reduction Victoria, for instance, even though we call ourselves an organisation of people who use drugs currently, we've got a policy that states really clearly that drug use, unfortunately, illicit drugs and the possession of them, is illegal. Therefore, having drugs at work is therefore illegal, and it's therefore not, it can't be tolerated. At least that's our official sort of policy. And within that, we are essentially being two-faced. We're essentially being hypocritical. And the reason for that is partly because, as a funded organisation, we can't be seen in any way to be justifying or condoning breaking the law. And yet all of our work, I would venture, all of our work sort of mitigates against those sort of policies. So our options are really diminished by the society that we're working in, the organisations we work in immediately. And I would say, to continue talking about harm reduction Victoria, we have other policies that are around those policies that and procedures that are around actually working with someone on their performance and ensuring that the issue is a performance issue and not a drug use issue. So i.e., we're not making the drug use or the person the problem. Ideally, we're talking instead about performance. And so we will only usually have those conversations about drug use if it's really clear and the person involved identifies that their drug use is the reason that they can't do their work at the moment. But I don't think that all organisations are like that. And instead, the drug use itself and the person becomes the problem. And we see that over and over and over again in our work and our advocacy work and talking to our members in our community. We are usually in these contexts described in terms of risk. We're a risk to an organisation. And we see that through the FUSE project that we're doing at the moment, which is about supporting peer workers. And I know Meals is in the audience, and she's working with Nadia, our HR person, who many of you will know from her time in Richmond and Yarra. And we're finding this over and over again that people who have lived and living experience in workplaces are thought of in terms of risk rather than in terms of the things we can bring to an organisation. That's not true of everyone at all times, but it is an aspect of our work. And the reason for this, I think, is, one of the reasons this is so difficult to fight against is something that I think we all would probably recognise and understand, and that's that there is sort of a really strong social and structural stigma that mitigates against us against us understanding and humanising people who use drugs. So this AFP Facebook post, Australian Federal Police Facebook post, is very recent, came out around Halloween. And essentially, you may or may not be able to read this, but ultimately they're sort of using the old chestnut of a computer generated aged face and thrown a few scabs onto it and said this is what it looks like when people start using methamphetamine. And this that just in this small amount of text, they managed to say pretty clearly that people who use meth are violent and unpredictable. They use a dehumanizing image and really clearly link it to the word monster. They link the symptoms of drug use to societal ravages. So they link sort of the ravages of this person's face to the fact that ice kind of sort of ravages society. And then they, not only that, they link drug use itself and the use of drugs by individuals to, condoning murder and death by vehicles. Finally, they managed to top it all off by saying clearly that we have no conscience. So the audience have to have a conscience for people who use drugs. Users are not just hurting themselves and putting at risk the ones they love, i.e. we are, irresponsible and unconscionable, literally. And it's pretty obvious that this is a pretty clear kind of political pushback by the AFP against the idea of drug use being a personal issue or a so-called victimless crime, and sort of putting a lot of the responsibility back onto individuals. And it's this sort of media, and this was part of a campaign that continued for some time. One of them even sort of suggested that people, if they're having drug use issues, that they call Turning Point, and this is despite the fact that Turning Point's been part of a Rethink Addiction, an anti-stigma campaign themselves, and have sort of, I assume they weren't asked if they could be referred to, but it's just everywhere and really difficult to avoid. And I mean, I'm sure you guys will understand this. However, I guess the reason I point this out is that they're able to do this because it's illegal, and society ultimately condones the laws that the police enforce, but they are only enforcing laws that we condone. So this drug prohibition that has gone on for many, for decades now, allows us to dehumanize each other. And these laws, I think, are the primary driver of drug stigma. They literally exile us into prison if we use or deal drugs, and they are one of the prime reasons that people are ashamed of using drugs and of being a person who uses drugs. But these laws remain in place mostly because politicians and policymakers just don't see any reason to change them. And we as voters don't punish them on these issues, I would venture. So it's a bit more complex than that, but we don't have sort of years or months or weeks to talk about this. So ultimately, we have to change the story that the public around us believe. And I think that really means telling a different story to the one that we currently do. And this is, I suppose, because we're a group of people who probably are what you'd call a supporter of messages that suggest people who use drugs deserve the same respect and care. I thought I'd talk a little about some work that was done by Common Cause Australia around how to message and how to talk to people who are actually persuadable around drug law reform, rather than talking to ourselves, which we often do, or talking to our opponents, which we often do as well. So the whole purpose of these sort of short and pithy, very pithy kind of pieces of advice around messaging is basically the idea that we should really try to avoid as much as we can activating our opponents and making them be part of a narrative, which is very easy to do, because so much of what exists in society is awful, and we want to talk about that. Sometimes that just actually is counterproductive. And the idea is to tell a positive story, ultimately. So I'm not going to talk about all of these, but this piece of research that Common Cause did essentially found a number of things that were actually counterproductive that we do as harm reductionists and people who care about people who use drugs and about the policy situation in Australia at the moment. I talk about a number of things that we do that are kind of mistakes, and you can find some of the stuff online, and I've got a link right at the end as well. But ultimately, it's very, very, very tempting for us to myth bust. But when we tend to get into sort of areas of doing myth busting and talking about things like the war on drugs being a failure, what these often do actually is galvanize our opponents, and they actually sort of activates them rather than persuading people who are persuadable. They're quite complex. They can be quite complex kind of issues sometimes. And most people just unfortunately, just do not have the engagement in the issue or the time really to engage deeply in an issue, to look at the history of the war on drugs and then and then sort of understand it in depth and understand why it's failing. It's very easy actually just to persuade people that yes, the war on drugs might be failing, but the answer is more laws, and that's ultimately what we've seen over the years. So the other thing that we do quite often is scare people, and by that I even mean things like talking about the number of overdose deaths that exist. The number of overdose deaths, we do this ourselves sometimes at HV, talk about the fact that there are more overdose deaths at roadside than the road toll. And that's an awful thing to do. But when you're talking to people who don't know, that's an awful thing, but when you're talking to people who don't either know the in-depth stats around this, or when you're talking to when your opponents hear that, all it does is just dial up intensity and activates your opponents. So basically it gives them an opportunity, I suppose, to say, yes, that's true, but the answer is this opposition thing. On the other hand, what we can do, and what was shown through this research with around 1,400 Australians who were all fell into the persuadables camp, what we can do and what we should do is frame our conversations and our narrative by our values and embed altruism and open-mindedness into Australians really tend to identify with this, oddly enough, and also point to the diversity of people who use drugs, and absolutely pointing out that stopping all drug use is unrealistic is a positive way to go, but that is quite different to talking about the war on drugs failing. Ultimately, I guess what we're trying to say with this work is that what we need to do is focus on people who are actually able to be persuaded to change, while not activating and encouraging people who are actively opposed. Common Cause found that this is probably, of all the issues that they looked at, this is the most polarized they'd ever seen, i.e. the people who support and the people who are opposed to drug law reform and to treating people who use drugs as humans ultimately, are more polarized and more in opposition than any other issue they'd ever looked at. So In our personal, so just to sum up, I suppose what I'm trying to get at is that in our personal life, we need to be brave. We need to call out not just the obvious awful things like junkie, but actually things like, have you worked at a place where a doctor has refused to prescribe OST? That's the sort of thing that's quite hard to challenge a colleague on, for instance. If you're in an organisation, maybe, based on what we were talking about before, an easy thing to do is to review your policy and have a look at whether or not it focuses on performance rather than the drug use. For example, this is actually really quite hard, especially for AOD providers who just actually want to help. Oftentimes we confuse our desire to help people and our clients with wanting to help everyone or wanting to help our staff. And I think that's something that we've seen over and over again as well throughout HAVIC. And finally, with structural issues, what hidden structural stigma existed at social sector and society level, and what levers do you have to make those change, make change and be part of change? Finally, I think it's really important to interrogate our own assumptions about what works to change minds. I felt really uncomfortable going through some of the Common Cause research to find that some of the ways that I think changing people's minds works actually may not work, because ultimately changing minds is one thing, but drug use and our ideas about drug use in society are highly emotive, and ultimately, where we might think it's not, we might want and hope that the world's a rational place, and that if we show people enough evidence, they will change the way they behave, or politicians will change the laws, or media will change doing what gets them the most clicks. But I think we've seen over and over again that that's just not the case, and that unfortunately it appears that it's more and more clear anyway that oftentimes things that we think would appeal to rational actually are much more likely to respond to something emotive and almost irrational. And so with that, I think it's just about really trying to find the stories that are most likely to resonate with the people who we want to persuade, and not get sucked into talking to people who are completely opposed to us, and being limited about how much time we spend trying to convince people who support us, which is, I guess, what we're trying to do here. Finally, there's a few links there. I think I've sent this to Nick. It will be available online. And if you search for the Common Cause Persuadables AOD Stigma or something like that, you'll probably be able to find the report that I referred to there, and I've also got it as well. So finally, I'd just like to thank you all for having me.
Thanks, Sione. I'd like to acknowledge what an amazing job that Harm Reduction Victoria has done in recent years and in the past in advocating for a more nuanced and more, I think, a real practical response to the issues of stigma. And I think we've come a long way in wanting to not have just an argument with people, but really understand where their fear is, because a lot of stigma, in my experience, is based on anxiety and fear rather than knowledge and personal contact and information. And I think you lead that really well, Sione. So you and your organisation are to be commended. We're lucky to have you in this state as an organisation. And I think I'd also like to acknowledge, in my very brief chairperson's report in our annual meeting, in our annual report, I need to acknowledge my own discrimination and stigmatising that I've carried out towards people who use drugs in my life. And I'm learning every day about how I need to walk away from that and change my attitudes, because a lot of it is now unintentional, but it still exists because we are part of a society that does this often without thinking. It requires a conscious effort. So thanks, Sione. Look, I've also, just before I turn to Bernadette Burchell, who's going to, by way of her executive officer report, respond to some of the issues around stigma and discrimination that Bernadette spent her mind to in the last couple of years as the executive officer of the forum. So without further ado, Bernadette, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Sione. I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land. I'm also on Wurundjeri land up here in Northcote. I agree with all the sentiments that Peter and Sione have said with respect to the land being taken, not ceded, and we would do well to listen to our Aboriginal brothers and sisters in management of the land going forward. I'm not going to be as slick as you, Sione. Very impressive PowerPoints there, but I do want to kind of respond to some of the things along the way. So the forum, everybody, all know what we do. We sort of run monthly community forums, and we, try and provide some, evidence to local issues and some leadership of problem solving within the community. So the local issues of the day, though, throughout this year, where we've sought to make a contribution, have been characterised by issues of conflict around the use of public space. So that's been with drug dealing and public injecting in the North Richmond, Abbotsford neighbourhoods and around the key overdose prevention service, the MSIR, and the public drinking law changes. So it's been an education for me. I think I wouldn't probably even know about some of these issues if I wasn't involved with the Yarra Drug and Health Forum. So it has certainly been for me, a learning curve in relation to these issues, and a real appreciation of the assets that are in our community, people like Sione and Harm Reduction Victoria, people like the Fitzroy Legal Service, individuals like Judy Ryan, the Neighbourhood Justice Centre, the Community Health Services. Like there are some, and the council, which is a progressive council, and I acknowledge Herschel and Amanda Stone, who are in the audience, I think, which is great. They attend some of these forums, they engage with the community around these issues, and we all put ourselves in a position of trying to learn and converse and not, and I guess we want to, the forum would be in that group of supporters of for Sione, and we're interested in influencing the persuadables and not probably giving too much airtime to the opponents. We were kind of trundling along okay, and then the pandemic struck and we had to go online. So that was a challenge for someone like me, because I don't like being online. I've just been to the hairdresser, so I'm happier today to be online than I have been for a long time. But the pandemic sort of upended our ways of doing things, forced us into, continuing business in an online way. And, there's been some real upsides to that. There's some downsides to it, but there's been some real upsides to it. We've had our reach has been much broader. We've sometimes even had, a couple of hundred people tune into forums. The one that Margaret Hamilton ran around the findings of the MSIR trial, had around 200 people participate and many more, tune into it being online later. Our International Overdose Awareness Day event always attracts a large number of people who, relate to this issue of overdose and the risk for, people who use illicit drugs. And because it is illicit. And that's been a learning for me through contact with Sione and with others, is just how much the fact of it being illegal is the problem, rather than it's the problem in terms of supporting a heroin drug trade in Richmond. It's a problem in terms of people, ending up in contact with the criminal justice system, because their drug of choice or drug of requirement is or dependence is illegal. So that brings me back to what can you do as a little Yarra Drug and Health Forum in this, very big space of, impacts at the local level of things that are government policy or to do with laws, to do with, people really, sometimes I think, I would say that Australian Federal Police thing, I'd posit that, that was to do with linking that with their big drug bust so that they can say, oh, look, we've saved you from, this terrible, monster parade that was going to be coming your way if we hadn't intercepted those drugs. I'm sure, so there are people who kind of improve their standing in the community and their political prospects through flogging people who use drugs. So, I've been on a learning curve with this. But I've gotten myself distracted wanting to engage with Sione's talk. So we've been consciously trying to raise issues or talk about stigma and discrimination through our forums, through the International Overdose Awareness Day event, because that came from where I think John Ryan said, what we should be doing is having one of those events every day or every week so that just the human face of this issue is just constantly out there. So we have been trying to, dedicate some forums to these issues. But it's, as Sione said, it's kind of like we're kind of dealing at a kind of individual persuasion level and also mostly talking to our own supporters. And so that's the challenge, I guess, for thinking about the worth and the value of the forum, which I actually, might have been less persuaded about before being involved in it, but actually am very persuaded about it now, is it's actually a really neat local opportunity to have conversations with people that aren't in your supporter base. I'm not saying that the way we're doing it, we've been constrained somewhat by that having to be online. So really you're kind of with your subscriber base when you're online. It's not an opportunity to actually reach into places where, people who aren't engaged with the issue aren't our supporters. It isn't where they, they're not subscribing and coming to our forums necessarily. It is our supporter base. So the challenge, I think, is for us is in addressing the stigma and discrimination issues is to remind ourselves about the law reform imperative that's there, and to advocate for law reform, for decriminalisation, for organisations to have policies of access that hold them to account for discriminatory practices, because it's a quality issue fundamentally. Access to services is a quality issue. And if we can do things like we've done with Rainbow Tick and LGBTQI inclusion, why can't we apply those to another group or community that's experiencing stigma and discrimination? Well, there's a little bit of a rave. I've resigned. I'm actually leaving the job, and Peter suggested to me that I do a bit of a valedictory type speech, and that's obviously not my comfort zone. So I kind of wanted to reflect a bit on my time with the forum. There were some significant assets in place when I came. There was the long-term funding and support from the state government and the City of Yarra and CoHealth as an auspice. The executive committee, I really recognised them as my tribe, a values-based grouping of people with skin in the game and a commitment to social justice, and a commitment to supporting the community to be inclusive and capable of addressing drug issues. The leadership and compassion and commitment of Peter as the chair is a definite asset. The progressiveness that's always been a feature of the Yarra community and the council, a habit and tradition of regularly meeting, though previously at the Richmond Town Hall and more latterly online, a comfort and confidence in the group, and Peter in particular, but in the group, of bringing people together in conversations around drug issues and actually managing, or talking about difference, respectfully talking about difference. So I think the forum's an essential bit of community infrastructure to successfully managing, the complex issues around alcohol and drug use. The big issue always seems to be, how do we bring the community along with us? Because people are, they'll think there's no votes in drug law reform. How do we bring the community along with us? And I think that it is really that hands-on conversational opportunity on a local level and masses of it. So I would be saying that every LGA needs a drug and health forum. It needs a kind of honest broker sort of a little bit of distance from, it doesn't belong to any one organisation. It's only really committed to the community, doing the best by its citizens. And I think that that's therefore, I think we're ripe for that to be the future. I think the forums does a great job and contributes in a very meaningful way, and that should be replicated across all the LGAs in Victoria, and then we might actually get, or even Australia, and then we might actually get the persuadables, that 66% of persuadables actually in a conversation with people who, can talk to them about these issues. So I have a little 12-point plan for a way forward. I see there are some government people here, so I'll let you have that. And that's that. The first one is advocate for law reform, decriminalise drug use, legalise heroin, look to the story of Portugal. There's a case study. The second thing would be to advocate for a heroin prescribing trial in Yarra and Melbourne, advocate for the cities of Yarra and Melbourne to endorse and advocate for such a service, advocate for more and better pharmacotherapy options, more detox services and AOD treatment services, advocate for harm reduction services, needle and syringe program workers, outreach workers, peer support models of service, more safe injection services in locations around Metro Melbourne and regional Victoria, advocate for safe injecting services for City of Yarra and City of Melbourne, advocate for all local governments to fund or co-fund with Department of Health local drug health forums as a vehicle for bringing the community along with evidence-based approaches, with us being a template, support local health and harm reduction services to engage with local neighbourhoods around drug issues, build and rebuild again relationships locally, bilaterally between the forum and police, local government, community health, AOD services, public housing, trader organisations, residents associations, and multilaterally linking services up with each other to share information, strategy and problem solve. Build and rebuild relationships between the forum and academics, public figures, media and influencers. Build the forum's capacity to contribute by building our volunteer capacity to contribute. Build a bank of lived and living experience people to participate in community education and problem solving around drug issues. Keep focused on reaching out to community and reaching into community to educate, engage, support problem solving around drug issues. So there's my 12-point plan. I do find the whole online environment just speaking to a screen quite disconcerting. So, but that's I think that's where I'd like to finish up. And I can refer you to our annual report for a more coherent description of our activities over the year.
I'd just like to say what a privilege and an honour it's been to get to know you and work with you, Bernadette. You're a very good human being. Your heart, your kindness, your wisdom and your energy has been outstanding to work with. We've been very privileged to have you journey with us for these last 2 years. And I personally want to testify to how much I've enjoyed and benefited from meeting you and working with you, and you putting up with my incredibly boring, irrelevant stories that I tell everybody. So thank you for being so gracious in putting up with that.
Yeah,
And I mean, it is true to say, I'm going to quote some Australian cricketers from about 4 o'clock this morning. We just love you, Bernadette. We just love you. We love you.
It's good I get out while that's still the sentiment.
Yeah. And so I think there's going to be a time to say goodbye to you, you know, more formally and towards the end of the year. And we will be advertising the role. We've reviewed the job description with Bernadette and Yasmin and Hing's help. We've reviewed the job description. But I'd like to say that everyone that's been in your role has made an enormous contribution to the work, and you are no exception to that, Bernadette. And your leadership has been respected and honoured and valued, and you'll be our friend in this space forever, whether you like it or not. Don't get away from my stories that easily.
I knew that was the deal.
Yeah. It's like a cult that doesn't demand anything from you. But anyway, did I really say that? But anyway, so look, I'd just like to move on to some remarks that I'd like to make about the year. Everybody in this room we know of and has contributed in some way to the work of the forum because we are part of the Yarra community. And we love the Yarra community. We love the diversity and we love the voices. We love the arguments and we love the disagreement. We love the tears and the laughter and the joy of the Yarra community. And it is a rich place. And during COVID, the last 2 years, we've seen the very best of the Yarra community. But unfortunately, there are still some things that need to change because nothing's perfect. We have to discover as a community our humanity, our compassion and our heart over and over again and reinvent that in a way that lifts everyone up and doesn't leave anyone behind. Now I'm speaking in weasel words to quote other people, but I really mean it. And we need to have an understanding that actually leads us to listen to the concerns and the fears and the anxieties of others so we can build a stronger framework as we go forward in the future. And so the forum is committed to reaching out to those that we haven't engaged with well, to those people from diverse backgrounds. The last 12 months has been fantastic to re-engage with people from the Aboriginal community in Yarra, and we've really benefited from that input. We have a strong commitment not only to those with lived and living experience of drug use, but those that have been scarred in their experience of lived and living experience of others' drug use. Because that is real too. We don't live in a perfect world. So we are equal opportunity embracers of each other's humanity. And that's how we want to be. We want to be listeners, but we want to be not silent around things that need to be spoken about and directed to. In my small piece in our annual report, I spoke about witnessing two heroin users in the mid-80s that were being strip-searched publicly in St Kilda by Victoria Police at about 4:30, 6 o'clock in the afternoon in the middle of winter. The young woman had to expose her breasts. The man had to take his underpants down because they were searching for foils of heroin. And my experience was, as everyone walked by, they were shocked when they saw this happening in the little alcove where the old St Kilda post office used to be in Fitzroy Street, until they realised and mouthed the words to each other, "Oh, junkies." They actually said that. They said junkies. And do you know what they did then? They smiled at each other as if there was nothing to worry about because this was clearly an acceptable way to treat people who use drugs. I would love to say the world has changed and that isn't acceptable. But I'm afraid, my good friends, this still goes on in all sorts of ways. And Sione quite eloquently talked about that. So until we start seeing everyone as equal and relevant human beings in our community with equal rights, equal aspirations, we are not going to change these attitudes. So the change begins with us. And it's had to begin with me because I am guilty. I'm guilty of all sorts of prejudice and discrimination in my life. It just isn't okay. It isn't okay when it's that negative. So the forum is committed to hearing the voice of those whose voices are never heard. The forum is committed to moving forward in a way that is respectful and inclusive And we have been led in the last 18 months to 2 years in that path by Bernadette. That is your legacy, Bernadette. That's a really significant legacy that you will leave in the work you've done. And we're all the better for it. So we want to have those discussions. We will go anywhere. We're reaching out to people and communities within all sorts of areas within Yarra to have that respectful conversation, not in the glare of public headlines or media, but in a way that actually builds bridges and understanding. So the last event we'll be running this year is in December, and I think it's the first Monday. Is that right, Bernadette? First Monday in December, and it's basically coined as issues around access to health, access to treatment, access to fair treatment for drug users as a human right issue. And we've had a great lineup of people that have put their hand up to speak at that event. And we're serious about this. And next year, we want to run an event where we talk to the diverse communities of Yarra, the Aboriginal community of Yarra, about what they understand as harm reduction. Because we don't have those discussions with our cousins in those communities. We don't have those talks about what harm reduction means for different cultural and historical understandings of that term. We want to broaden the discussion. And we want to bring people with lived and living experience of drug use into that discussion in dialogue with those communities and from those communities. So we have a passion and a flavour to make this real and put boots on the ground with it and to do something constructive. And in concluding, I'd like to acknowledge the enormous support that we've got from the Department of Health, the old DHHS, in funding us for all these 22 years or whatever it is. I'd like to acknowledge the City of Yarra, not only for their funding, but their genuine partnership that they show towards us. We've had outstanding support from council officers and councillors over the, especially the COVID period. And also the service providers, the residents, the community leaders and the community members. It is an absolute privilege to work with you. We are enriched by that experience. So on behalf of the forum, I'd like to acknowledge all those folk, again acknowledge the work that Bernadette has done and her legacy that she will leave, and wish her the very best in her future endeavours as a change agent and just a damn decent human being. And I'd like to also acknowledge the work, finally, of the executive of the Yarra Drug and Health Forum. Some of you are here today. Adam's here, Yasmin is here, Hing is here. Who do I see? I can't see everybody's name. So sorry?
Kim.
Kim, oh yeah, sorry, Kim. Oh God, missed out Kim. There'll be a contract out on me. But I'd like to acknowledge the work of the executive, and these people give their time up for nothing, and they do our power work. I just like to say, what a fantastic group of human beings you are, and it's the best meetings I go to. Maybe apart from Aboriginal Melbourne, I love the Aboriginal Melbourne meeting. I found my surrogate tribe in Aboriginal Melbourne. If they'd have me, although I don't know a tribe that really would welcome me. But it is a real privilege to be part of that, and a real privilege to see people trying so hard to be creative about doing the right thing and improving the community. And there are plenty of people that are allies in that, and many of you are here today. This issue is crying out for leadership. Let's lead together. It's not just one person that will lead this. It'll be collective leadership. And all power to CoHealth as they try to and attempt to create a brand new health experience around the new supervised injecting facility at the CBD. And all power to North Richmond Community Health and to Dr. Nico and to his staff and the people that work there for the outstanding job in saving people's lives they've done. We should not be ashamed or embarrassed about that work. That is an outstanding success. And let's just work together, have our arguments, but learn to respect each other in really practical ways. So that's my little rave. And I'd just like to thank you all for coming today. And I'd really encourage you to come to the first Monday of December. And Trish Aziram is here. I want to tell you about Trish. Trish is a bloody legend in the public policy area around drug and alcohol in this state. And it is a damn shame that people don't listen to her more often. She's worked at Viniac, she's worked in Brotherhood at St Lawrence, a life of commitment to just causes and making a difference in the lives of the most vulnerable. And the room is full of people that are doing that now and will do it in the future. So this is a special day for us. And the final thing is a shout out to all the mums and dads and families that have cared and loved for people who have suffered from the discrimination of using drugs. And in some cases, that discrimination has directly caused the death of those people, unfortunately, because stigma is a fatal condition when it's inflicted on people. It's a disgusting thing that we do, and we need to stop it now. So, without any further ado, I think we're done. And I'd like to thank you all for coming. And again, thanks to the Aboriginal community for allowing us to meet on their land and being so gracious about it. We're online. Nick Wallace, the invisible man, what an amazing job that he's done in helping us. I even left him off the executive, but Nick does a very small amount of paid work for us and a lot of voluntary work for us in allowing all our website and online presentation, which has been outstanding since he's took over, especially since I had anything to do with it. An amazing effort, Nick. And put yourself on camera, Nick, because I can't see you. I'd like to acknowledge the work that Nick does. What a fantastic effort. I don't think I've missed anybody. If I have, it's completely accidental.
Oh, I just wanted to quickly, on behalf of the executives, thank yourself, Peter, as well for your leadership.
Yeah.
And, staying power and continuing to be in there and, walking the talk. Thank you.
It's very kind of you here. We're all in this together, though. Okay, well, I think that's it. So thanks for coming today, folks. And if you want to be involved with us, you only have to ask. There is no barrier to people contributing to the forum. No barrier at all. So thanks for coming today, folks. Have a great day.